Now I'm ready for the Financial Week with Heather Payton.
Hello, jobs and how to save them. Does Labour really know? Can Clintonomics save America? And the Bank of England's new governor. Does it really matter who it is? Joining me, three guests, as usual, economist Richard Jeffrey of Charterhouse Tilney, Patricia Hewitt, former advisor to Neil Kinnock, now deputy head of the left-inclining think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research, and Joel Stern, whom I'm tempted to describe as a Wall Street whiz kid, which would be a terrible cliche. Joel, there's an awful lot of big words in the piece of paper describing you. What do you actually do?
I run a company in New York that acts as an advisor to company boards of directors and senior managements, and I teach economics at Columbia University in New York.
And why are you known as Pluto?
I'm known as Pluto because I appear on a regular television program as a panelist, but we've got 25 panelists, and some of us don't rotate as frequently as the others, and I rotate the least frequently.
Okay.
This is Sky at Night.
Well, we almost made it to 3 million out of work. We get another chance in a month's time when we'll almost certainly succeed. It's quite an achievement for a government that won the election on promises of recovery. But let's not get too political. Who's to say things would have been better had Labour persuaded us to break the habit of a decade, or indeed if the reins of power since the last recession had been firmly in the hands of Kinnock & Co. Perhaps it was coincidence that Labour chose this week to launch its budget for jobs. It's jolly nice that someone cares about those 3 million blighted lives, of course, plus the millions that don't get counted. But can this really be the answer, even an answer? Labour quite rightly draw attention to investment in training and skills and help for the small firms that may provide the future jobs. The idea of regional development agencies in England may even raise some cheers. But it's the question of how to pay for the goodies that brings out the cynics. Not this time the higher taxes on people that cost so many election votes, but taxes on the privatised companies that everybody loves to hate. Do we really hate them that much? So is Labour's way one that we should follow? If not, what is the best route out of the maze? A couple of quick answers. Is this really the way that it should work, Richard, first of all?
Well, I don't think that anybody can complain that this government isn't spending enough. We have a public sector borrowing requirement which is headed for 50 billion, which is astonishingly high. What we haven't got in the economy is enough growth, and it's growth in the end that creates jobs. And I'm afraid government retraining schemes might help jobs very longer term, but it's not going to create any.
So you don't think it's going to work? Okay, Joel, how does it look to you?
I don't understand why you would think that the government would know how to train people better than the private sector would. You mean the government that's going to spend this money on job training is also going to assure the people who are being trained that there will be jobs when they finish in the areas in which they're being trained?
Patricia, then, how do you defend this against the people who say that Labour's heart is in the right place but its pocket is full of holes?
Well, Labour is clearly quite right to say that one of the central economic problems we now face is the level of unemployment, and it's not simply those 3 million people and their families who are being blighted.
Well, I think even the Conservatives would say
yes,
that, wouldn't they?
But it's the other people who fear for the loss of their jobs who are also not spending and not investing. So I think Labour's quite right to say that, amongst other things, what the government ought to be doing, instead of letting the public sector deficit go up and up in order in part to pay for unemployment, they ought to be, for instance, releasing capital receipts from council house sales in order to invest in further house building and renovation, because that is something that doesn't suck in imports, that can be done pretty quickly, and that creates a heck of a lot of jobs in the private sector.
But what about this idea of a windfall tax on profits of the big companies? But is this really the right way to go about it?
Well, it seems rather a smart idea. I mean, Gordon Brown, as Shadow Chancellor, was faced with arguing very strongly the case that he was making last year for a substantial between 1 and 2 billion investment in infrastructure projects from the public sector, from the public purse. Clearly, it would be madness to say that that should be funded by simply letting the PSBR go up even further with the prospect of even higher tax increases in the years to come. And therefore, the idea of a windfall profits tax, something, of course, that the Conservatives used on the banks in 1981, on utilities whose profits have risen about 70% during the recession, seems like rather a good idea, and certainly one that will appeal to the voters.
Yes, Richard, there was that tax on the banks, wasn't there?
Well, there was, but I find what Patricia is saying quite bizarre. What are the utilities doing with these profits? They're not paying them all out in dividends, and if we have a windfall profits tax, it isn't going to cut the dividend payouts that they make. All that will happen is they will cut back on their capital spending, and it's capital spending you're trying to get going. This is a complete and utter mirage, and it is a con job which is being put forward by the Labour Party because it looks good.
Joel, can you imagine this sort of idea being put forward in the States?
It's being put forward in the States. The talk in the Clinton administration is we have to invest in infrastructure.
But I'll bet he's not talking about taxing the profits.
It's not important to me as to where tax revenues come from. What is important to me is government spending as a percentage of the GDP. That's the true level of government, and your size of government is way too high. As an outsider, I would say to you that if I were giving advice, I'd say the first order of magnitude is to slash tax rates very sharply and to slash government spending. If you were to do that, you'd increase the size of the private sector, and the investments the private sector would make would not be like the corrupt investments that we're going to see in our country.
Unfortunately, if we did slash government expenditure, and it's not clear that the UK is much higher than other countries like Germany. In fact, it's about the same sort of level as a percent of GDP. But if we did slash government expenditure, all we would find is that we would cut back on programs like health, and we'd end up with a health system such as exists in the US today, which is a complete disaster.
And
Excuse me,
considerably more expensive. And it's the kind of arguments we've been hearing here that have actually helped to reduce the long-term competitiveness and industrial, the capacity of British industry in particular, to cope with global competitiveness. And this old-fashioned nonsense that public is bad and private is good has really got to give way to the kind of understanding that they have had for years in Germany and in Japan, that public and private need each other, and that it holds back the private sector if government is not investing in decent education and training, if government and private sector together are not building decent railway systems. And the sort of short-sightedness which says we can't afford long-term investment because it's going to take so long to work. If the French had argued like that 20 years ago, they would not have built and invested in the high-speed railways, which have been such an engine of growth in the regions of France, which 20 years ago were backward rural economies.
I don't think too many people are objecting to the idea that we need more training, more education, more skills. I think that's pretty self-evident. I think the problem
is the present government has been cutting training expenditure during the recession, which does seem doubly mad.
They say training's a good thing, though. But it's the problem of how to pay for it, isn't it?
Of course it's got to be paid for. And I think, those who don't like the windfall profits tax need to start thinking about other things. Now, it does seem to me that we really need to rethink quite seriously sources of government revenues. And as a longer term and more radical measure, certainly one of the things we ought to be looking at is much, much lower taxes on earned income, much lower taxes on labour, which is after all rather a good thing, on work, and much higher taxes on energy use and on pollution. And I think as a long-term, not an overnight strategy, a major shift from taxes on income towards taxes on expenditure, and particularly polluting expenditure, would be a very good thing indeed.
Okay, Joel.
It is my view that one of the reasons why the UK has had such difficulty is because people like we have here at this panel are so willing to change the rules of the game with such a high degree of frequency. Every year, the Chancellor of the Exchequer will come in with a new set of tax guidelines and budget and so forth. How are private entrepreneurs ever supposed to be able to calculate their after-tax returns on investment when the lives of their investments go out 8, 10, 15 years? The way in which you want to go up and down and sideways, and you'll tax a little bit more here and a little bit less here. If I were an investor, I wouldn't put my money into the UK. Why would I do that?
But the interesting thing, of course, about the US is that it has a very low investment to GDP ratio, lower than exists in the UK or the rest of Europe. It also has very low productivity growth. And in fact, if you look at European growth since the First World War, you will find it is much higher than US growth.
I must correct you on that.
Area, it's been 0.5% higher per annum.
No, it turns out that the productivity improvements and levels of productivity have never been higher in the last 30 years than they were in the last 8 or 9 years, with the exception of the most recent 2, during which we had our recession. In fact, the one thing that I don't understand the UK has failed to learn is the lessons that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan taught them. And that is when you rely on the private sector, the economies do well, and when you tax, you'll get less, and when you subsidize, you get more. What you want to do is subsidize the private sector by reducing the role and taxes that are drawn by the government.
Patricia.
This is completely balmy. I mean, this business about learning the lessons of Thatcher, when we left it to the private sector in the way that you're describing, what was actually happening was we had a completely unsustainable consumer credit boom, fueled by financial deregulation, not matched by any significant investment or increase in productive capacity, and we're all still paying the price for the hangover from that.
That's wrong, Patricia. That is wrong. wrong. By the end of the 1980s, we had an investment to GDP ratio which was higher than in West Germany and a lot higher than in the combined Germany. So you must look at the facts. We did have a consumer boom, we did have a credit boom, but it didn't go on for the whole of the 1980s. It actually went on effectively from 1988 onwards. The middle part of the 80s, effectively from 81 to 87, were extremely successful years for the UK. It outperformed all other major economies. I don't know what numbers Joel has been looking at for the US, but it certainly isn't internationally recognized numbers, because if you look at the recognized numbers, productivity growth in the UK has been second to none.
It's all gone horribly wrong now, though,
Two
hasn't it?
points need to be made.
It went
First of
wrong
all,
under
that
2 years
period-
of Nigel Lawson,
But that
unfortunately.
period in the middle of the 80s was preceded and followed by extremely deep recessions, which have weakened our industrial capacity. And the other point that needs to be made is that over the period, the last 13 years as a whole, the share of consumption in total expenditure has increased and the share of investment has fallen. And this is a huge problem. And you can see the results of this in the lack of investment in the things on which our future depend, which include education standards and training.
I
Private
think this
sector.
one can run and run, and we've got to move on. So, the United States has just had its unemployment figures too, and like ours, they were worse than expected. There may be a recovery, sort of, but it's not producing jobs. In fact, apart from the glamour and glitter of the inauguration, it was not a week of triumph for the world's biggest economy. IBM Big Blue illustrated the problem of turning around a supertanker by chalking up the biggest corporate loss ever, and it also warned of more difficult problems to come. Is IBM an analogy for the whole of America? And if so, what should the new president do as he prepares his State of the Union speech for delivery next week? Joel, what should he do?
I'm wondering whether or not they'll let me back into the country this weekend if I tell you what I really think.
Come on.
But it'll give the chance for your colleagues over here to do one on me as I did on the UK a few minutes ago. The first thing to realize is that almost all job growth in the United States in the last 25 years has taken place in companies of size of less than 500 employees. So it's no surprise to me that very large companies are doing a pretty poor job of managing their affairs. It is my belief that the reason why they've got the problem is their failure to decentralize and to empower their employees, and to also require their employees as part of their compensation to own some form of equity in the company in which they work. That way they would take a longer-term view toward productivity improvement and the like. Now, in terms of what President Clinton should do, I can't even get myself to say that yet, but what he should do is do nothing at all. I recently gave an economic forecast in the United States that was called Please Don't, Mr. Clinton. You see, again, by the time he would implement any of his so-called infrastructure investment, which incidentally I would urge you to realize would have very low rates of return for our society, but by the time that would have an impact on real economic growth, this economy will have been another 9 to 12 months down the road. Our rate of growth is now running at just about 3%. It will be running at around 3.25 to 3.5 in most of 1993, with nothing being done by the Clinton administration. Just leave well enough alone. What they could do is slash tax rates, because our economy has done so well. Our tax revenues are now running much higher than they were prior to Ronald Reagan's cutting those tax rates more than 10 years ago.
Richard?
I have to say that there are some things I admire about the US economy. I think it gives tremendous encouragement to entrepreneurship and things like that. But I have to say that your analogy to the old supertanker is rather good. I think it's a rusting, single-hulled supertanker which is rapidly taking on water. And Joel is suggesting that the captain ought to abandon ship. Well, I'm not surprised. But one of the things that we will find in the US is that it starts to generate jobs rather more quickly than the UK does. And that sounds quite positive. But the irony is that it does that because it's a less productive economy. What we will find in the UK is that most of the increases in output that come through over the next 2 years will come through productivity growth entirely. Now, that is actually a positive feature of the economy, but it's very difficult, of course, in social terms.
Patricia, you had a lot of Democrats over here to talk to fairly recently. What sort of thinking did that lead you towards?
Well, it's fascinating because it was a conference about Clinton economics, and it was quite clear that nobody yet knows what Clinton economics is going to be. There's a big contest there going on
Least of all
about
Clinton economists.
well, I think, yes, you're different Clinton economists have very different views of Clinton economics. And in particular, the argument about, do you focus on cutting the deficit versus increasing long-term investment is absolutely enormous. But where I did find enormous agreement was that one of the first things that President Clinton needs to do is to get cracking on healthcare reform. not only because that is a hugely wasteful system, far more expensive than ours, which at the same time leaves millions of Americans uncovered for their healthcare needs, but also because of the uncontrolled rise in health spending is one of the major sources of the increase in the government deficit, and therefore sorting out the healthcare system and doing so in a way that enables them to bear down on medical costs is going to be central to a strategy for getting the deficit
Talk
down.
about nonsense, I must say. I'm going to tell you the major reason why such expenditure appear to be out of control is simply because it takes place through government in the first place. It is Medicare and Medicaid spending that is out of control, and here's the reason why. People pay on the left hand, and they get their benefits on the right hand. Once they've paid into the system, there is no limit to the number of visits they can make to their physician and to the hospitals and for their pharmaceuticals. No wonder it's out of control. The nice thing about going to a store to buy something for yourself is that the price of the good is right there on the merchandise. If it's not worth it to you, you won't buy it.
Joel,
but if you put all the money in over here and you can take as much out as you want on the other side, what limit is there?
Joel, as you must know, you have precisely the same problem in the private sector of medicine, and rich people in America are notoriously getting a great deal of medical treatment that they do not need because their insurance policies cover it, their doctors can charge for it, the insurance companies pay, and the administrative costs of running that system are enormous and far higher than those of the NHS here.
Joel, before we move on, given the sort of problems, we're hearing about a few of them that President Clinton now faces, how long is the honeymoon going to last?
The honeymoon, yes. Well, it depends. The major reason why the honeymoon will last longer than I would like it to is that the media in our country, which is concentrated in the Northeast, which is where the recession was most serious in the United States, was extremely unfriendly to George Bush and to the Republican administration, and frankly to Ronald Reagan before that, spending much of their time misinterpreting the fantastic years of real economic growth we had during the 1980s. What we'll find now is that those very same people who are left of center politically, they're going to be favoring what he's going to say. So that if the economy should not perform well for any reason, they will be just filled with long lists of excuses to accommodate the performance of the economy. I would say that, unfortunately, Clinton and his administration, unless he makes appointments like he just tried to in the Attorney General, is likely to have friends in the press and the media for much of the 4 years and with very little to worry about.
Okay.
Sounds
now,
great.
Some news just in earlier this evening. The next governor of the Bank of England is to be Eddie George, the current deputy. Not perhaps an inspired choice, but perhaps a safe one. Richard, is it safe, inspired? Should it have been an outsider?
I don't think anybody could say that the choice of Eddie George was inspired. I must admit, I think given the failures of banking regulation that we've seen over the last decade, this would have been an opportunity to have got some fresh blood into the Bank of England who could have reviewed that area. John Major has already said that monetary policy is going to remain firmly with the Treasury. We're not going to have an independent central bank, so I don't think that is necessarily an issue. But I think the arena of banking supervision is, and some fresh blood is required in the bank now.
Patricia?
It just seems to be a very, very bad and worsening English habit never to change people at the top when things have gone wrong. And the BCCI scandal revealed some very big deficiencies in the Bank of England, and the idea of appointing the number two, whatever his personal qualities, to the number one job seems to me quite wrong. And we're seeing, frankly, exactly the same attitude at British Airways, where everybody's saying, oh, we didn't know it was happening, we didn't know it was happening, nobody's heads are going to roll, and the number two is going to take over the number one, both the number one jobs very soon. And it seems to me an utterly corrupt and conservative way to try and run a major institution which is vital to the economic health of the country.
It's not just Conservatives, it's actually a Labour way, because I seem to think that John Smith, who was responsible for the downfall of the Labour Party in the last election, was promoted to the number one job straight afterwards.
Richard, thanks. That's all we've time for. Richard Jeffrey of Charterhouse Tilney, Patricia Hewitt of the Institute.